A grey morning lifts over Omuta, Kyushu, Fukuoka POW Camp No. 17 on the 1st of September 1945. Coal dust from the Mitsui Mieke shafts has a way of living on the eyelashes, and it lives on private. Jack Mercer's. He steps onto a crate and wire scale, the kind a miner would improvise, and watches the pointer tremble at 98. His ribs tally the months better than any calendar. The zinc works sends a medicinal sting through the barracks. The smell is rust and boiled radish and human breath. Far off, a noise murmurs at first, then gathers like a storm without thunder. It is not artillery. It is too even, too patient. It is the steady contrail hum of B-29 engines at altitude. Yesterday those bomb bays carried fire over Kyushu. Today, rumour says, they carry something else. Jack's mind resists the word. Food is not a thing that falls from the sky. Food is a tepid gruel teased with a radish shaving. Food is a promise always already broken. The camp has learned to move slowly, to spare calories the way a careful man spares matches. Men wait in the yard like punctuation marks, thin and upright and barely there, the sentence of their lives not yet complete. From the sea comes a wind that tastes like iron. The sun finds the wire and lights it as if to say, "See, this is the line between hunger and whatever comes next." A corporal jogs across the yard, half in disbelief, half in duty. Parachutes are opening, white flowers above the guard towers. Crates thud into the dust hard enough to ring tin. A medic's jeep hood has been painted white and stenciled with a red cross. Its arrival is both fact and miracle. Someone laughs, the dry bark of a man who has forgotten how to do it. Jack holds his mess tin the way a parishioner holds a hymn book. He does not move until he is ordered to. He remembers Camp O'Donnell. He remembers the hellship's hold. He remembers that every bite after true starvation is a negotiation with the heart. He will not rush the negotiation. The guard with the arisaka doesn't move either. His uniform webbing is salt white with sweat, his eyes ringed in the same hunger that walks the yard. Above them, parachute silk blossoms like a second sky. The first crate hits near the laundry barrels. Jack's tin rings when splinters fly, a clean, sharp music he has not heard since before Bataan. It is a new kind of bombardment, and it sounds like mercy. Bataan, 10th of April, 1942. The road lifts heat in shimmers, the kind that makes a man imagine water where there is none. Noon pushes the temperature toward 37, 38 degrees, and the air feels thick enough to chew. Canteens slosh, then are kicked, then are empty. A Japanese corporal taps a swagger stick against boots and rifles, pacing a column that snakes towards San Fernando and the railhead, 60-odd miles of dust and decision. Jack Mercer is 21, his service shoes. He walks in the grammar of orders and need. When a prisoner staggers, the column adjusts the way a snake does around a stump. When a friend collapses, there is the arithmetic no soldier wants. 1 man carried is 1 man slowed. 1 man slowed is 2 men punished. The guard's Type 38 bayonet glints in the sun like a metronome for cruelty. A canteen is unscrewed and poured onto the road, a ceremony of contempt called the sun treatment. The water disappears before it can darken the dust. Somewhere ahead there will be rail cars, and somewhere beyond those cars there will be a camp with a name he does not yet know, O'Donnell, perhaps, or Cabanatuan. He counts the things he can, heartbeats under the tongue, steps to the next scrap of shade, the angle of a guard's cap that means trouble. A medic shows him how to take a pulse with 2 fingers and think in beats per minute, as if a man could ration his own life the way he rations hardtack. The column passes a sugarcane field brilliant enough to hurt. A Filipino farmer watches stone still, hat crushed in both hands, and then looks away because looking is dangerous. A Japanese private mouths phrases about honour and shame learned in a schoolyard a world away. None of it fills a stomach. Flies do their grim accounting on shirts and open mouths. At dusk the air cools by a degree that might as well be a decade. The road widens near a drainage ditch. Men barter a minute of shade for a swallow of memory. Jack touches the dent in his canteen the way a man touches a medal. He is learning new doctrine on the march. Count what you can control, carry only what you must, and never trust hope that costs you calories. Near midnight, they halt by a culvert slick with algae. Men dip helmets, pretend the water is clean, and pay for the pretense by morning. A sergeant from the 31st whispers the route in fragments. Mariveles to Balanga to San Fernando, like a catechism meant to keep the mind from breaking. Luzon, July 1945. The intake tent is canvas and discipline. Lieutenant Kenji Sato stands at attention because it is the last habit that still fits. A US sergeant takes his weight, pulse, a quick look at gums and sclera, notes edema with the blunt pencil of someone who has done this all summer. The form slides under a clip. Another clerk asks him to sign acknowledgement of rights he has been taught not to believe exist, rations equivalent to depot troops, medical care as available, mail when possible. Weeks pass. The war folds in on itself. September brings a lake-cold wind to Wisconsin and the chain-link neatness of Camp McCoy. Sato reads the calorie board in halting English. 3,000 to 3,600 per day, more if prescribed. Bread arrives warm enough to steam the room. A dietitian, Lieutenant's bars bright as a new coin, explains refeeding in Japanese that is careful and slow. Small portions first, watch for swelling at the ankles, pay attention to the heart's insistence. Sato nods because obedience is easier than belief. He sits where he is told, at a table that will soon feel like routine. Across the barracks, a band practices a swing number with the brassy confidence of a people who never expected to go hungry. The guard's sidearm stays holstered. The coffee is bitter and alive. In the corner, a corkboard holds weight charts that climb. The first week, he gains 2 pounds. The third week, he is 5 pounds heavier and less certain of the world than he has ever been. He writes to his father about bread instead of honour and cannot finish the page. The camp issues canteen coupons. The PX sells stationery, cigarettes, a comb. A corporal jokes about a shirt too tight across Sato's chest and then has it exchanged for the next size without ceremony. The exchange is the ceremony. Somewhere in the same country, a factory once called a plant because plants grow built bombers by the hour, and across the war, the United States produced numbers that beg a language. Something like 355,000 aircraft against Japan's 76,000. The ratio is not a statistic to Sato, it is a feeling, as if a hand resting on the table were the table. He begins to suspect that feeding the prisoner and defeating the army are expressions of the same grammar. The lieutenant quotes the law as if it were a prayer. Geneva requires equal rations, equal clothing, equal medical attention, and then points to the line for second helpings. The phrase surprises Sato more than the fence. Second helping is a strategy he has never practiced. He swallows warm bread and feels it sit in his stomach like a decision that has decided him. Northfield, Tinian, late August 1945. The flight line glows with a light that never completely leaves the Marianas. Tea Sergeant Louise Hart walks a chalked bay with a clipboard held like a weapon, checking pallet after pallet. 10-in-1 ration crates, powdered milk in drums, sulfur packets in metal tins, quinine, vitamin envelopes, medical instrument rolls wrapped to survive a hard landing. She runs a palm across parachute silk and feels the ghost of yesterday's missions shiver there. The bomb hoists are quiet. The cargo nets look like new doctrine. A crew chief reviews the numbers out loud, ritual for luck. Bay volume, lashing points, canopy diameter, breakage rate if wind shear plays rough. 2 parachutes per heavy crate, colour-coded bundles for identification on the ground, redundancy because abundance buys reliability. No strafe, no fire, says a placard in stenciled black, the strangest order these men have ever gladly obeyed. The navigator marks Omuta, Yokohama, Mukden on a grease pencil overlay. Coordinates once used to center bombs will now be used to center mercy. Louise signs off on weight and balance. The B-29 sits like a promise, pressurized fuselage that once stitched cities, a bay that can swallow 10,000 pounds without complaint. She thinks about the problem backwards, how to turn speed and altitude into accuracy without a Norden sight, how to put calories where they are needed without breaking the men who will eat them. The answer is repetition and margin. Enough planes, enough pallets, enough chutes, enough colour codes that even mistakes land useful. The smell of the bay is cordage and cocoa, oil and paper. Air crews load while armourers drift past, instinctively fingering nothing they will need today. A young radio operator asks if the silk can be salvaged. Bandages, blankets, baby slings, Louise says, and realises she has been measuring waste on purpose. The waste will feed someone. The briefing repeats the new catechism: altitude, airspeed, wind, drop sequence, radio codes for ground recognition. If a camp signals with panels, waggle. If villagers gather, circle wide and drop beyond the fence. No photography unless requested by ground medics. In the corner of the room, a map blooms with circles of range and time. They will be out and back before the heat builds, a closed loop of mercy drawn across blue water. The operations officer, dry as a ledger, estimates 1,000 sorties in the coming weeks and roughly 4,500 tons of food and medicine across the theatre. Numbers that once described destruction now describe distribution. Someone murmurs that one day's crates could equal a month of rations inside a camp. No one argues. They simply initial the form and move to the next pallet. When the bomb bay doors cycle and the checklist reaches hatches secure, Louise keeps her hand on the silk a moment longer, as if touching the edge of a different kind of weapon. Omuta, 1st to 3rd of September 1945. The air above the wire turns white with silk as if the sky were exhaling. Crates strike the yard and jump apart, their wood splitting into clean fragments that smell like resin and rain. A jeep hood painted with a red cross noses through the gate, and a medic climbs down with the economical movements of a man who has worked too many emergencies to waste motion. He points with 2 fingers, firm and calm. Slow, small bites. Your body has to remember. Jack Mercer holds a half tin of milk like a chapel object. The first swallow stalls. Sweetness shocks a tongue that has forgotten the idea. The second swallow finds a path. A nurse checks his ankles for edema, touches his sternum for a heartbeat that is running too fast to be useful, and cuts his portion with a look that could command an army. We start gentle, she says, 3,000 to 3,600 a day for most. More if prescribed. Vitamins, salt. We watch. The yard becomes a choreography of mercy. Parachutes snag on a guard tower. Civilians hover beyond the fence line. Mothers, children, old men made thin by the same blockade that starved their prisoners, and then edge closer when they see how the boxes are opened. A US interpreter, Japanese careful as porcelain, lays out the order. Medical first, then food. Equal rations under law for all prisoners. The guards nod because hunger is not ideological when your belt is on the last hole. Jack tastes the stew in the 10-in-1 and finds it almost unbearably rich. His mind conjures Camp O'Donnell's dust, the hellship hold, the mine shift at Meek, and the simple arithmetic of not dying another day. A medic takes down his weight, chalks 98 onto a board, and draws a small empty square for tomorrow. He thinks of squares as battles that can be won. A crate bursts and throws up a brown cloud. Cocoa drifts across the yard and settles on helmets and shoulders like a benediction. The smell undoes men who had forgotten sweetness was a smell. A parachute is cut into bandages on the spot. A boy beyond the fence licks condensed milk from a splinter and laughs, and the laugh hits Jack's ribs harder than any blow. In the makeshift ward, the therapeutic diet board carries a separate figure, 3,800 calories for the worst cases, paired with thiamine and niacin schedules, sulfur for ulcers that look like maps, quinine where fever sits in the eyes. The nurse taps the numbers as if they were coordinates to bring a man home. By evening, the chalkboard shows a list of names and a dozen tiny gains. In the guardroom, someone divides a biscuit as if it were ceremony. Above the barracks, the silk still flutters in the wires, a white flag that means surrender to hunger, not to honour. Camp McCoy, mid-September 1945, a sky the colour of rain-washed tin. Lieutenant Kenji Sato stands at the end of a chow line and tries not to stare at the posted calorie chart. He reads each digit as if it might change when he blinks. 3,000 to 3,600 calories per day for men in general issue, more under medical order. A corporal moves down the line with the casual authority of someone who has never had to choose between dignity and a second helping. "Refill on the right," he says, and the phrase lands like a foreign doctrine that will be taught with bowls. Sato's hands shake when he holds the tray. Bread, stew thick enough to remember its ingredients, coffee that bites and wakes. He sits at a table where guards and prisoners can see each other without the heat of fear. Across the room, a chalkboard lists weights and dates, simple proofs that bodies can be rebuilt. He marks his own numbers quietly. 2 pounds the first week, 5 by the third. He feels a strangeness that is not shame and not pride. It has a new name he cannot yet pronounce. A medical officer visits with a notebook and a set of questions for a study that will outlast the tense. Do your gums still bleed? Do your hands tremble? Are you dizzy on standing? The officer speaks Japanese slowly, clearly, with the professional skepticism of someone who has learned not to trust either despair or euphoria. He warns about refeeding. He smiles when the pulse cooperates. He writes, progress. The PX sells stationery and cigarettes. Canteen coupons fold into pockets with an ease that offends no one. Sato learns words he never needed in the field: inspection, laundry, mess. Then the one that will not leave him alone: generosity. It arrives every noon in steam and noise. At taps it lingers like the smell of soap. News circulates in figures that should be rumours but are not. Liberty ships, 2,710 delivered, a record hull assembled in under 5 days, moving oceans of grain and munitions. Aircraft by the hundreds of thousands. A single relief window worth thousands of tons. The numbers seem designed to humiliate, yet they do not land that way. They land as inevitability rendered visible. He begins to see that feeding an enemy can be a tactic sharper than any blade. Rain rattles the windows. The band in the recreation hut tries out a swing tune that sounds like a future arriving early. Sato folds his weight chart into the shape of an envelope and writes home about bread. He stops halfway through a sentence and realizes the war inside him is ending on schedule, 1 calorie at a time. December 1944 to January 1945 returns like a fever that never quite broke. In the memory hold there is diesel, urine and wood swollen with sweat. The names come in a chain: Oryoku Maru, Inura Maru, Brazil Maru, and the chain does what chains do: it binds and drags. Jack learned to breathe by counting 10 heartbeats in, 10 out, because air was a ration no one had issued. The ships were unmarked, which meant the ocean hunted them honestly. When torpedoes struck, the sound was a door torn off its hinges, and the dark grew teeth. Men vanished without graves, a fact he could state in any language and never make smaller. Time jump forward, September 1945. The yard at Omuta is a geometry of silk and rope. The contrast lands with the force of arithmetic. On those hell ships, bodies were stacked in a space that would have been assigned to crates on a decent freighter. Here, crates fall from a sky that has turned logistical. He remembers how the holds stank of iron and heat and men who had turned to whispers. He remembers now how the airdrop smells of resin and cocoa, oil and paper, and a future that can be opened with a crowbar. What an empire cannot move, it cannot feed. Japan's rail and sea lanes had been strangled by mines and submarines long before surrender. Guards and prisoners alike were on the last hole of their belts. The difference was that the Americans could take an aircraft designed to unmake cities and make it carry food with the same efficiency. Even the failures, the crate that splinters, the chute that tears, leave salvage, a waist-high mercy that would have been unthinkable in a hold where even breath was contraband. Louise's kind of math would say pallet breakage might run a few % on a gusty drop. Jack's kind of math says even that sliver, scooped and rationed, is more protein than a week's thin soup. He takes his spoon like a craftsman takes a tool and carves the day into survivable pieces. A medic leans over and checks his pulse with 2 fingers, the old lesson from the march returned in a cleaner uniform. At night, the silk hangs in the wire like a new flag. Haruko watches from the edge of the yard as guards share a biscuit without looking at each other, a ceremony with no words. She recognizes the truth without liking it. The enemy's waste is her neighborhood's feast. Jack folds beneath a blanket sewn from parachute panels, the same fabric that once slowed bombs. He closes his eyes to the phantom sway of the hold and tells himself a new story. The ocean is behind him now. Above him, the sky is a warehouse that will not run out. Northfield, Tinian, runs on a rhythm that could have been pressed onto vinyl, engines spooling, dollies clattering, the staccato of checklists. Louise Hart stands with a clipboard and a pencil stub, a priestess of the ordinary miracle. You can feed men you cannot yet touch if you get the sums right. She strokes parachute silk by habit, checks lashing knots, initials column after column, weight, balance, canopy diameter, projected drift at altitude, estimated breakage, and watches as the B-29's open bay becomes a thesis about scale. She has seen the charts that make pilots whistle. Somewhere between 1939 and 1945, American factories pushed roughly 355,000 aircraft into the world, while Japan managed about 76,000. The ratio is nearly 5 to 1, which is to say the air itself had been colonized by arithmetic. It is not a taunt, it is a weather report. Liberty ships, 2,710 of them, made oceans into boulevards. One hull famously slid from keel to launch in roughly 4 days and some hours, a flex of industrial sinew that sounds like myth until you read the yard logs. Against that river of steel, the enemy's transport was a trickle. You cannot nourish an army through a straw. The drop briefing is shorter now that the crews are fluent. No strafe, no fire. Altitude, airspeed, crosswind. If the ground panels show a triangle, the camp has organized recovery. If not, stand off and try again. Red bundles are medical, blue are rations, yellow are special, milk powder, instrument rolls. She runs a thumb down the manifest and feels the comfort of redundancy layered on redundancy. If one crate splinters, 2 will land clean. If silk tangles, there is silk enough to fail again. On the ground at Omuta, Haruko sees how abundance behaves. Men open crates with crowbars like old friends. A boy lifts a tin and cannot decide whether to run or pray. The guards, hollow-eyed, let the medics work because law is a rumour they want to believe. The coal ledgers at Mika would have shown production slumping into the bottom margin. The drop ledgers here climb. Jack feels the stew's heat in his hands before he tastes it. He cannot plausibly imagine the warehouses that birthed this moment, the rail spurs and conveyor belts and punch clocks and lunch whistles, the way a nation of shift workers has reached across water to change his blood chemistry. He does not need to. He eats slowly, the way a man reads a letter from home he intends to memorize. The bay doors close somewhere beyond the clouds, and the plane is already on its return arc, obedient to a timetable that might as well be fate. On Luzon and in repurposed schoolrooms across Japan, wards bloom like careful gardens. Cots line up beneath windows that stick in their frames. A kettle ticks on a black stove. Chalk dust shares the air with ether and laundry soap. Jack's chart shows 98 on the first day, then a small stubborn climb, 2 pounds, then another, then a pause when his pulse outruns good sense. We start gentle, the nurse repeats, a doctrine disguised as kindness, 3,000 to 3,600 calories for most, 3,800 if the body can take the load, thiamine and niacin to close deficits that have grown teeth, sulfur on ulcers shaped like continents, quinine when fever makes the eyes shine too bright. He learns the sensation of fullness returning, which is different from the sensation of being safe. A medic explains what the body does when famine becomes feast, the heart's surprise, the electrolytes panic, the way fluid pools in ankles like regret. The numbers become mileposts. He finds that he trusts mileposts. In the next bed, a man carves a spoon from crate wood and says nothing while he works. Across the ward, someone laughs at a joke too small to be repeated and too large to be forgotten. The scale becomes a kind of altar. You step up, you offer what the week has made of you, the needle trembles, the nurse nods or frowns and writes the sum. Gains are celebrated with an economy of praise that feels like professionalism rather than sentiment. Losses are met with plans, not pity. In the doorway, Haruko stands with a bundle sewn from parachute silk, bandages folded into triangles, a blanket hemmed with uneven courage. She would not have believed she would hand such things to foreigners and mean the gesture. Now belief is a luxury she can shelve. On the far side of the ocean, Sato sits on his own cot and watches a medical officer draw a simple graph. Weight over time, pulse against intake. The line climbs with a steadiness that embarrasses him until it steadies him. The officer notes for a study that will be cited in classrooms long after the tents are packed. Therapeutic refeeding saves lives when done with discipline, kills when done with zeal. The lesson is not narrow. It says victory must be administered like a medicine, measured and watched and recorded without triumph. The impossible statistic hides in the quiet efficiency. In 3 weeks of relief sorties, thousands of tons of food and medicine have crossed water by air, as if calories were a kind of ammunition. The total, in places, outstrips what whole camp networks had managed to move in a season of scarcity. Jack does not know the sums. He knows the way his hands stop shaking when he picks up the spoon he did not have to carve. He eats, and the ward exhales as if one more rivet has found its hole. Autumn brings damp wool and paper dust to rooms where translators sit with sharpened pencils. Jack tells what the nights at Mika were like. Frost spidering the rafters, soup thin as breath, coal dust that turned to mud in the lungs. He learns to say Fukuoka Camp 17 without swallowing the number. Clerks from the company that took the labour, men whose jackets still fit, shift in their chairs, while terms like least manpower and allocation shortfalls try to disguise bruises that never learned to lie. The language of production, when peeled, has the same colour as hunger. The lawyers ask about rations and winter and beatings done to men too light to fall loudly. Jack answers because truth, once it finds a mouth, wants work. He does not exaggerate. He does not need to. A judge notes for the record that Japan signed but did not ratify Geneva. A historian reminds the room that adherence to international law was claimed in principle and starved in practice. The symmetry the law prefers has never survived contact with supply. Haruko sits outside a courthouse 1 city over, a child on each side, and hears rumours that some companies will apologise, that somebody may one day say publicly what everyone can already recite. She does not care what the word will be. She wants proof that the arithmetic of the yard, 1 biscuit divided, 1 blanket shared, was not a hallucination. She wants a ledger that adds up to something human. Records unspool, camp numbers, unit designations, guard rosters, requisitions that turned men into entries on forms. The proof is not theatrical, it is clerical. And yet, it convicts. When the question turns to what the United States did with its prisoners, the answer sounds like a catechism learned in basic training. Rations equal to depot troops, medical care as available, clothing and shelter under regulation. It is not a boast. It is a habit, and habits, when multiplied, become culture. Jack steps into the pale winter sun and realizes his coat is new and warm and issued without ceremony. He feels his pockets for a comb and a folded card that says he is fit for transport home. On the steps, a correspondent asks him if he forgives anyone. He thinks about the guard who divided a biscuit, and the foreman who looked away, and the doctor who kept a man alive with a pencil and a chart. He says the only thing that feels true. "I'm hungry," he answers, and the crowd laughs without knowing why the sentence sounds like a vow. He walks toward a canteen and counts his steps the old way, heartbeats under the tongue, and finds that the number no longer hurts. Louise sits with 3 transparencies laid one atop the other, the map table lamp turning acetate into stained glass. The first is aircraft production, a rising American line that looks like a stairway for giants, roughly 355,000 by war's end. A Japanese line a fraction as steep, roughly 76,000. The second is relief tonnage over 3 September weeks, figures that would have sounded obscene to her in 1942, but now feel like a reflex, thousands of tons by air, calories flown like sorties. The third is a sober bar chart of POW mortality. Japan's columns shaming the page, Germany's whispering by comparison. She has the impulse to apologize to the paper for making it carry so much. Across an ocean and a fence, Sato studies a smaller, humbler graph in a camp classroom, his own weight climbing in deliberate inches. The American instructor, a lieutenant with chalk-dusted fingers, explains what charts can do. They make arguments without adjectives. When your enemy can deliver destruction and then deliver nutrition with the same predictability, he says, the conversation is effectively over. Sato stares at the lines until they feel like rails and understands his platoon never had a chance that would survive arithmetic. Louise flips the layers back and forth and notices what she hadn't meant to measure. The margin that allowed for waste, the torn chutes, the splintered crates, the duplicated loads, was itself a weapon. In some places, a single day's airborne deliveries likely exceeded what a starving rail network could pull in over a week. The surprise is that she feels no triumph. What she feels is relief that the machine they built could be turned in a day, like a gun that also fires blankets. She writes a phrase she has been repeating to herself since the first drop. Margin is mercy. It sounds like a slogan until she counts how many men are alive because checklists multiplied into policy. She thinks of Jack without knowing his name, of Haruko's children licking condensed milk from a stick, of Sato folding a chart the way soldiers fold orders. The graphs have no faces, the faces give the graphs their teeth. When she steps outside, Northfield is a silver geometry under a high sun. Maintenance crews roll ladders, ground handlers swing chocks, a crew chief slaps a fuselage twice for luck. She tucks the transparencies into a folder and realizes there is one graph the papers do not hold, the one that shows a nation learning to aim mercy. If it has an axis, it is time across discipline, and the curve climbs because people made it climb on purpose. 20 September 1945 arrives with coffee and soap and a scale that ticks because machines like to be heard. Jack steps up, breathes as instructed, and watches the needle settle at 116. The nurse grins like a victory poster, writes the number, and tells him to try the toast carefully. He laughs without sound. The ward smells of bleach and linen and something baking. The smell reaches back to a kitchen in Connecticut where his mother saved bacon grease in a jar and war was a radio voice. He tries not to cry because crying is thirsty work. On the other side of the world, Sato folds his final weight card into the envelope he has been writing all month. He has found a humility that does not taste like shame. He will tell his father that the enemy fed him as if he were one of them and that the fact did not break him. It rebuilt him into someone who can recognize law when he eats it. The band in the recreation hut hits a bright wrong note and turns it into swing. Outside, rain makes the gravel smell clean. Haruko sets a tin flower on the family altar and lights a match. The flame has to be coaxed, It trembles, steadies, and throws a small warmth against the photograph of a man who drowned working the docks, because blockade is a word that drowns quietly. She does not forgive or accuse in that moment. She inventories. Her children are fed. The winter has blankets no one owned last year. The silk above the wire turned into a sheet that will outlast the memory of the wire. Louise stands on a catwalk and watches a super fortress roll, a machine designed for one vocabulary now speaking another. She thinks about doctrine that learned to feed after it learned to fight, about checklists that became prayers answered by effort. She knows the numbers as if they were family names. 2,710 Liberty ships, a record hull in 4 days and change, aircraft by the hundreds of thousands, relief tonnage that redrew maps of hunger in 3 September weeks, and she knows the names the numbers saved will never be fully counted. If there is an impossible statistic worthy of a last page, it is this. A free people produced so much that even their mistakes fed strangers. Jack buttons a new shirt and feels the cotton insist he belongs to the living. Sato slips his envelope into a mailbag that will cross a continent by rail, an ocean by ship, and a city by bicycle because systems want to work if you let them. Haruko blows out the match and watches the smoke draw a line straight up, as if the sky were still a warehouse and still open for business. The planes arc home on rails of light, and the ledger that once tallied bodies now tallies pounds regained, which is to say few